Welcome back to another episode of the Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is British writer Johann Hari. He is the New York Times bestselling author of books such as Chasing the Scream and Lost Connections. They have been translated into 38 languages and received praise from people like Oprah, Elton John, and Naomi Klein. The occasion for today's conversation revolves around his latest book, Stolen Focus, which should definitely be on your must-read list for 2022. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Johann Hari to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Johann, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Doug, I'm so happy to be with you. I'm in Miami at the moment, but Baltimore, where you are, is one of my favorite places in the world. So I'm probably the only person in Miami who was wishing I was in Baltimore, but I am.
Yeah, you're probably, yes, the only person I know who wishes they were in Baltimore instead of Miami. Instead of most people here, they're like, I wish I was in Florida right now because the temperatures are starting to get quite cold here. I've been looking forward to having you on the podcast for years. Ever since I started it, you were somebody who I wanted to bring on, and I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen and talk about your latest book, Stolen Focus, which is phenomenal, by the way. You unpack so many things that people need to hear right now. But I guess my main question is this. I think when people think of the word focus, at least me, they think of it as like completing a task. They think of it in the sense of business, like getting something done or writing or whatever. But for the average person, like, why is focus so important?
I would say thanks so much for what you just said, Doug. I'm really moved by that. So I say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever done in your life that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is, that thing that you're proud of took a huge amount of focus and attention. Almost everything we're proud of requires depth, focus, and attention. And what's happening to us at the moment, I learned in the research for the book, is that our ability to focus and pay attention is breaking down. I came to this for a personal reason. I felt that my own attention was getting worse. It felt like with each year that passed, things that required deep attention, like reading a book, were getting more and more like running up a down escalator. And I was very uncomfortable with it. And I could see it happening to so many people around me, particularly some of the young people I loved who seemed a lot of the time to be kind of whirring at the speed of Snapchat. So I kind of dipped my toe into the research. I was quite taken aback by what I saw. For every one child who was diagnosed with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. The average American office worker now focuses on any one task for only 3 minutes. Imagine a work life that's dissolved into a kind of hailstorm of 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, a churn all the time. But I wanted to understand this in more detail. So I went and traveled all over the world to interview over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus, from Miami to Melbourne to Moscow to Montreal, to even in cities that don't begin with the letter M. I don't know why I just did that. And I learned from these experts that actually there's scientific evidence for 12 different factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that have been that can make your attention worse have been hugely rising over the last few years. So we are in a serious attention crisis. And I think your question is so important, Doug, because when you're in an attention crisis, when you can't pay attention, your ability to achieve your goals breaks down. Your ability to solve your problems breaks down. And you just become, when it gets really bad, you become like a kind of stump of yourself, right? You can sense what you might have been if you've been able to apply yourself, but you just you feel like you can't get there. And that's why we need to look at how we actually solve this problem. Does that ring true to you, Doug?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've noticed it in my own life. I heard you on an interview and you guys were talking about when you took your hiatus without technology and going without technology, like what the impact that had on you. And I've even thought about myself, like putting myself in your shoes when I've deleted apps, like even checking my phone, even if the apps aren't on there just out of habit, or even the fact that even the books I'm listening to now or reading, like I'm listening to them while I'm driving. I'm not sitting down like in a chair or or even in bed before I go to sleep reading a book. It's more traveling in the car. And I think like where I want to go with our conversation, I know there's a lot you talk about in the book that is out of our control when it comes to our focus, technology, social media, and a lot of the brains behind that. But I think people would really get a lot out of some of the things they can control. And there is a lot we can control. There's a lot of things that we do on a daily basis that make our attention span much worse and allow us to become hyper unfocused super quickly. So out of the 12 factors you talk about in the book, like what are a few of them that you think that are most important for us as humans to take control of?
It's so interesting because when I started, I thought that basically there was two problems here. That I didn't have good enough willpower and that someone invented the smartphone. And actually what I learned is those were insanely simplistic ways of thinking about what's happened. There's 12 factors that are doing this to us. Actually, tech, although it's a significant one, isn't the biggest. But I would also say, I'll get to one of the specific causes in a minute that you've asked about, Doug, but there's two levels at which we've got to respond to these problems, right? The way I think of it is we've got to play defense and we've got to play offense. So you think about defense, there are all sorts of things we can do to defend ourselves and our kids against this invasion of our attention. And I talk about dozens of them in the book. But we've also got to go on offense together against these factors, because at the moment, it's a bit like someone who's pouring itching powder over us all day and then leaning forward and going, hey, buddy, you might want to learn how to meditate. Then you wouldn't itch so much. And you want to go, yeah, okay, I'll learn to meditate, but fuck you, we need to stop you pouring itching powder over me. And that's something we can do as well. I went to places that have done that. So I think it's easy to get into a division, and I'm tempted to do it sometimes, where you go, well, there are things I can do, and then there's all these bigger factors there's nothing I can do about. But the truth is we can do something about both. There's stuff you can do in your own life, and together we can take on these big forces in all sorts of ways. And I went to places that had done that, and we can talk about that a bit later. But let's think about saying an example of something that's playing out in the lives of everyone listening and what they can do about it immediately, and then a collective level to it, right? So let's think about something very simple. I've hidden my phone in this room, so I can't see it while I'm talking to you. But lots of people, I'm sure, have done podcasts with you where they glance at their text messages while you're asking a question, right? And it turns out this switching between tasks really damages your focus and attention. And I began to understand it properly when I went to MIT to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, a man named Professor Earl Miller. And he said to me, look, there's one thing you've got to understand about the human brain more than anything else. You can only think consciously about one or two things at a time. That's it. This is just a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The human brain has not changed significantly in 40,000 years. It ain't going to change on any time scale any of us are going to see. You can only think about one or two things consciously at a time. But we have fallen for a mass delusion. The average American teenager now believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time. So what scientists do is they get people into labs and they set it up so they think they're doing lots of things at the same time. And what they discovered is you can't do more than one thing at a time. What you do is you juggle very rapidly between the tasks. You switch, you switch, you switch. What was that on Facebook? What did the person just text me? What did he just ask me on this podcast? What's on the TV over there? You're juggling. And it turns out that comes with a huge cost. The fancy psychological term for it is the switch cost effect. And it turns out when you try to do more than one thing at a time, you will do all the things you're trying to do much less competently. You'll make more mistakes. You'll remember less of what you do. You'll be much less creative in your tasks. You'll just screw up a whole load more. And that sounds like a small effect, right? You think, okay, maybe that's true, but what does it do? Does it take 5% off my ability to do it? There was one study, there's lots of research on this, but there's one small study that really drove it home for me. Hewlett-Packard, the printer company, got a scientist in to study their workers, and he split them into 2 groups. And the first group was told, just do whatever your task is for the day and you're not going to be interrupted. And the second group was told, do whatever your task is, but you're going to have to answer a heavy load of phone calls and email. So pretty much the way most of us live, right? And at the end of it, they tested the IQ of both groups. The group who had not been interrupted performed on average 10 IQ points higher than the group that had been interrupted. To give you a sense of how big an effect that is, I know you're in recovery, so you wouldn't do this, but if you and me sat down together now and we got stoned, we smoked a fat spliff together, it would lower our IQs in the short term by 5 points. So being chronically distracted is twice as bad for your intelligence as getting stoned. You'll be better off sitting at your desk, getting stoned and doing one thing at a time than you would what most of us do these days, which is sit at our desk, not get stoned, but be constantly interrupted. Obviously, to be clear, better to neither get stoned nor be interrupted if you want to focus. And this really drove it home to me. This is why Professor Miller said to me, we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of these interruptions. If you're interrupted, a guy called Professor Michael Posner at the University of Oregon discovered, if you're interrupted, it will take you on average 23 minutes to get back to the level of focus you had before you were interrupted. But most of us never get 23 minutes without being interrupted. So we're constantly operating at this lowered level of our brain power. Students, when you study them, if they receive just 8 text messages during a lecture, it lowers their performance in a test on what was in the lecture by 30%. We're all losing that 30% so much of the time. So I want to think about how we solve this. There's all sorts of ways we can solve this. And I want to stress again that tech is not the biggest cause of this. There's all sorts of other changes that I'm sure we'll come to. People can change what they eat. They can change how much they sleep. There's a whole array of factors they can change. But let's think about a very practical thing that I did. You've talked about, I did a big experiment when I went offline for 3 months. We can talk about that. But something I integrated into my life. I'm pointing, but that's kind of dumb because you can't see the other side of the room. But behind my laptop, I have something called a K-Safe. K-Safe is a very simple thing. These guys should totally be paying me commission because I keep recommending it on podcasts. It's a plastic safe. You take off the lid, you put in your phone, you put the lid on, and you turn the dial and it will lock away your phone for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day. I use it 4 hours a day, every day. I will not sit down with my partner to watch a film unless we both put our phones in the K-Safe because it does my head in if we start texting. I won't sit down and have a meal with my friends unless we all put our phones in the K-Safe. It's hard at first, but the pleasures of being able to think clearly and focus are so much greater than the pleasures of distraction and being constantly interrupted. So that's an example of an individual thing. But I want to talk about a collective one example as well, because the truth is, loads of people will be hearing me say, I put my phone away for 4 hours a day, and they'll be thinking, well, fuck you, I can't do that, right? I might get messaged by my boss. I might get messaged by, there's all sorts of reasons why people can't do that. And in France, they made a change based on this. So in France in 2018, they were having a huge crisis with what they called le burnout, which I don't think I need to translate. And the French government, under pressure from labour unions, set up an investigation to figure out, well, what the hell is going on here? And the investigation discovered that 35% of French workers felt they could never stop checking their email or their phone calls because their boss could message them at any time of the day or night, and, they had to answer. So I can give people, I remember when we were kids, Doug, the only people who were on call were doctors and the president. And even doctors weren't on call all the time, right? Almost half the economy is now on call all the time. So I can give everyone in that position all the sweet self-help lectures you like about, buy a K-Safe, sleep more, all of that. They can't do it, which is why the French government made this big change. They introduced a law. It's a very simple law. It's called the right to disconnect. And it says every French worker has 2 rights. Firstly, you have a right to have your work hours legally defined in your contract. And secondly, you have the right to not have to check your phone or email after those work hours are finished. So I went to Paris, obviously before the plague began, to talk to people about this. It's really changed people's lives, right? So that's an example. Now, that won't happen unless we all fight for it. But all sorts of things that used to be the case are not the case because people fought for them, right? The weekend was invented 150 years ago. Workers used to have to work 7 days a week, right? They fought like hell to get a weekend. And I would argue in this new world we live in, a right to disconnect is just one of dozens of changes we're going to have to fight to make. But those bigger collective changes will free people up to make the individual changes. Of course, there's all sorts of things we can all do now as individuals, but we can also fight for these bigger changes.
Right. And I'm so glad you brought up what can be done collectively, because you're right. If we can only do so much to help mitigate the fire, but if there's something else that's continuing to pour gas on the fire and it's continuing to grow and grow and grow, it's just going to be like a never ending battle. But, I do want to go back to that individual that maybe isn't working for a big corporation, or maybe it's just somebody that's I just can't seem to pay attention. I'm scattered. I'm constantly like looking at 4 or 5 screens, or maybe I have a kid who's looking at 4 or 5 screens. Like what can I do? Like, how can I start to take small steps to detox myself from some of these things to regain some of my attention and focus? Like, what would you tell that person?
So nudge me to come back to kids in a minute, but I would start with one of the ones that I really struggle with, and I want to be honest about that. This is a real struggle for me. Of all the factors in the book, this is the one I find hardest, and it's about food. So there's this really interesting new movement called nutritional psychiatry that's looking at how the way we eat affects the way our minds work, our mental health, our mental capacities. And what they've discovered is that the way we eat in the Western world, particularly here in the United States, is really damaging our focus and attention. And there's 3 big ways it's doing that. So let's imagine you eat the kind of breakfast I grew up eating, a sugary cereal or like white bread, right? What that does is that releases a huge amount of glucose, a huge amount of energy into your brain really fast. And it feels great. It's like you're woken up. I was taught about this by one of Britain's leading nutritionists, a brilliant guy called Dale Peck. You feel like you've woken up. But what happens is you get to your desk, or your kid gets to their school desk an hour or 2 later, and your energy just crashes. And you get what's called brain fog, where you can't think very clearly until you have another sugary carby treat. Then you get another release of energy and then another patch of brain fog. So the way we eat means that we live on a roller coaster of energy crashes and energy spikes throughout the day. The way Dale put it to me, the nutritionist, is it's like we're putting rocket fuel into a Mini. You know, those little cars from Britain in the 1960s. It'll go really fast for 5 minutes and then it'll just stop, right? A second way is your brain needs all sorts of nutrients in order to develop. And the current Western diet, the way we eat, deprives people of those nutrients really significantly in the case of a lot of them, like omega-3s. And supplements just don't do it, right? The evidence is they don't, because your body doesn't absorb nutrients from supplements in the way it does when they're contained in proper food. There was a really interesting study in the Netherlands where they took a load of kids and they split them into 2 groups. And one group continued to eat in the kind of normal way that people do in the Western world, and the other group was put on a diet where they had to cut out all that shit. And the kids who cut it out and had to eat sort of fresh, nutritious food, 70% of them had an improvement in their attention, and the average improvement in their attention was of 50%, which is staggering, right? The third way is that our food, it's not just that our food lacks stuff we need, our diet lacks stuff we need, it's that it contains stuff that acts on our brains like drugs. So there was a study in Britain in a place called Southampton. They got 297 kids and they split them into 2 groups. And the first group was just given water to drink, and the other group was given water that was laced with synthetic dyes of the kind that you get in M&Ms, candies, all sorts of food that you get at the supermarket. And the kids who drank the second group, the synthetic dyes, were significantly more likely to become hyperactive, manic. So you can see how if we move to a diet that is, and this is really hard, right? And we live in an environment that's rigged against this, where, you know, we are taught from when we're very young to associate positive feelings with shitty food. More 18-month-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. We live in an environment where, you know, food is the cheap food that most of us can afford is the food that fucks our brains in this way. And the healthier food is harder, more expensive. So there's all sorts of reasons why this is a challenge. But if you move to a diet that's fresh, nutritious, and, you know, this is a very recent change. You know, I had a real realization about this because my dad's from Switzerland. My dad grew up in a wooden hut on the side of a mountain in Switzerland. And I grew up in London, as you can tell from my weird Downton Abbey accent. And my dad, when I was 9, my dad decided to start sending me every summer to go and live with his parents on their farm, right? He's like, go to Switzerland, that will make you a man, he would say to me. Yeah, it was you must live on the farm, kill the animals, it will teach you. And when I arrived, so I was raised mostly by my Scottish grandmother, who was a working class woman. And so basically we ate what working class Scottish people eat, which is like fried food, you know, microwave food. I mean, the invention of the microwave was the happiest moment of my grandmother's life. And when I arrived in Switzerland, my Swiss grandparents ate pretty much like almost all humans had in history. They ate fresh, nutritious food they grew themselves, and they ate animals that they farmed themselves. And I remember when my Swiss grandmother, when I arrived there, she first put this food in front of me. I remember literally saying to her, "This isn't food. I want food." Right? And her being like, "What do you mean?" And her being completely puzzled. And then eventually, about 3 weeks later, I bullied her into taking me to the McDonald's in Zurich. And when she sat down in McDonald's with me, she looked at me and said the exact same thing. She said, "This isn't food." She wouldn't even try it because she was so horrified by the sight of it. So in the space of 3 generations, just from my grandparents to me, what we eat has completely transformed. And it's not the fuel that humans are designed to take, right? As Dale put it to me, that nutritionist. It's just not what we're meant to eat. And we all know it's causing obesity and other problems, but it's really fucking up our ability to get our minds to work. So that would be one of the first things I'd look at. I mean, I could talk about lots of others, but that's one of the first things I would recommend people look at.
For sure. I mean, nutrition plays a massive role, not just in our ability to focus, but our sleep, our stress levels, our mood, like how we interact as humans. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. I want to get into one of the other factors you talk about, and that's our sleep. I mean, so many of us, we're overstressed. We're not sleeping enough. Our energy is our energy is so low at times just with the amount of stress we're enduring and our inability to get good quality sleep. So if you could speak for a few minutes on the correlation between poor sleep and our ability to focus and attention, and maybe some ways that you found that have been proven to improve the quality of sleep over time.
Yeah, so there's 2 really important things you brought up there, Doug, sleep and stress. They're obviously related, but just remind me to talk a bit more about stress later if we have time. So I went and interviewed the leading experts on sleep in the world, many of them. And it was so shocking to me. So there has been an enormous decline in how much people sleep. Children sleep 85 minutes less than they did a century ago, and kids tend to become manic when they haven't slept. The National Sleep Foundation says that Americans overall sleep 20% less than they did a century ago. So this means that we are exhausted. 40% of Americans are chronically sleep deprived, which means they sleep less than 7 hours a night on average. And there were loads of things I learned about this, but there was one moment that really drove it home for me. I went to interview a guy called Dr. Charles Czeisler, who you should totally have on your podcast, by the way. You'd really like him. He's arguably the leading sleep expert in the world. He has advised everyone from the US Secret Service to the Boston Red Sox on sleep. And he was the first person in sleep research to combine 2 technologies. He combined a technology that can scan your eyes to see what you're looking at, and a technology that scans your brain to see what's happening there. And what Dr. Czeisler discovered is that when you're tired, you can appear to be awake, you're looking around you, your eyes are open, you're talking, and yet whole parts of your brain can have gone to sleep. This is called local sleep because it's local to one part of the brain. So when we say I'm sort of half awake, that's not a metaphor. A lot of us are going around literally half awake. In fact, he discovered if you've been awake for 19 hours, which doesn't feel like very much to me, your attention deteriorates as severely as if you were legally drunk, which is remarkable. And I wanted to, so he said to me, even if nothing else had changed, even if this was the only thing that had changed, that alone would be causing a very serious attention crisis. But I wanted to understand why this is, right? Why is sleep so important? And one of the people who helped me most to understand this is an amazing woman named Professor Roxanne Prichard, who's at the University of Minneapolis, where I interviewed her. And Professor Prichard explained to me, we think about sleep as just, nothing's really happening in sleep, right? You're just inert. It's like a passive state. That's how scientists used to think about it 100 years ago. But actually, sleep is an incredibly active process. As she put it to me, when you're sleeping, you're repairing. Your brain is cleaning itself. Your brain is washed through with a watery fluid. Your cerebral spinal fluid channels open up, and all the kind of metabolic waste that builds up during the day, what she calls brain cell poop, gets washed out of your brain and gets carried down to your liver and carried out of your body. But if you don't sleep, that doesn't happen. You often feel like hungover and clogged up when you haven't slept properly. That's because your brain is literally clogged up with metabolic waste, right? So these necessary processes happen when you sleep. and all sorts of necessary processes. Dreaming is a really important process for dealing with stress. It's a way we rehearse the events of our life without being flooded with stress hormones. We dream much less than we used to because dream in particular comes in the 7th to 8th hour of sleep, and a lot of us just don't get that. Some of the most important elements of dreaming. So it's a disaster for our attention, particularly disastrous for children. And as I say, in children, lack of sleep will largely manifest as mania. For us, it's sort of drowsiness. Kids will actually want to run around more and more when they're sleepy. So absolutely prioritizing sleep is really important. It's one of the biggest changes I made since I started to do this research. And there's certain things that will really help people. Part of it is about understanding the role that artificial light plays in this. So Dr. Seisler said to me that human beings are as sensitive to light as algae, right? Our whole body clocks are set around light. And there's a particular thing that I think it's really worth everyone understanding. And the way he helped me to understand it is, so imagine you've gone out camping and you haven't set your tent up yet, and it starts to get dark. As it starts to get dark, you will experience a surge of energy in your body, which is really helpful in evolutionary terms. It means that you can set up your tent, right? You can see how this evolved in human beings. As it gets dark, we evolved to get a sudden surge of energy because that'll get you back to the cave. That'll get you back to the tribe. That'll mean you can set up your tent. But the problem is now we control the light. So imagine that you're lying in your bed and you're watching TV on your phone, and then you switch it off to go to sleep. What's happened is you've triggered that surge of energy because suddenly it got dark. So your body evolved to go, oh, it got dark. He needs to get back to the cave. Let's give him a load of energy to get back to the cave. But you're already in your cave. You're in your bed, right? So your sleep will be much less good than it should be. So this is very challenging, but people should not look at any artificial light, particularly glowing screens, which are like staring into an electric light bulb, for at least 2 hours before they go to sleep. They shouldn't drink caffeine after 5 p.m. I really struggle with that because I would fucking freebase caffeine if I could. There's all sorts of things. And think about the K-safe that I was talking about before, the thing where I lock away my phone. I put my phone in that 2 hours before I go to sleep and I lock it away for 6 hours because it means that I can't crack then. I can't suddenly go, oh shit. You know, the bit where you go, oh, but I'll just check that one email, right? Which means staring into the glowing light. If I've locked it away, I can't do that, right? People always say, but what if there's an emergency? I mean, the K-safe is pretty flimsy. I could just smash it open if I needed to. I just have to buy another K-safe. It'd be $80 or whatever it is. So yeah, there's all sorts of things around sleep that are essential for us overcoming this.
Absolutely. And I've even noticed in my own life that when I don't sleep well, like the next day, like things are totally off for me. I have brain fog. I have lower energy. My workouts are down. I feel myself more irritable and more anxious. So that's been a big goal of mine for 2022 is to do the things that I know that kind of work to optimize my sleep because it's so important. Now,
well, that's really important, Doug. Just to say one thing about what you said, because I think it's really important and it helps us to understand something about the tech element of this, which is the way I came to think of it is the technology we use is specifically designed to hack and invade our attention. I'm sure we'll talk about how and why. But I thought of that, think of that as like a virus, right? That would have been powerful at any point in human history. But that virus arrived at a moment when our collective immune system was already down, right? Our ability to resist it. We were sleeping much less than we used to. We were eating in a way that damages our attention. We're exposed to air pollution that causes brain inflammation that damages your attention and focus. There's a whole array of factors, 12 of them that I go through in the book, that are damaging our focus and attention. And then the tech arrives and we're much easier targets for it, right? Now, we've got to deal with the tech element as well. But we can strengthen ourselves at the other end as well by strengthening our immune system. Exactly what you said about when you haven't slept. TikTok, it's much easier to scroll through TikTok for 2 hours if you haven't slept the night before and you're just, looking for a way to sort of haze out. Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right.
All right, so we've touched on tech. I know you've kind of hinted at it a few times, and I definitely want to dive into it because I want people to understand like where we're at as far as what people's attention spans are, whether it's an adult or a teenager, how productive we actually are, and the role that tech plays into that. So I know we've touched on like multitasking and why that's detrimental to our ability to focus and pay attention, that sort of thing. But let's talk about tech. So if you could give like a bird's eye perspective, like really paint a picture for people on why tech has such a big impact on us, and also some statistics on our attention spans as the rise in the rise of the use of technology.
Yeah, so the figures on this are kind of shocking. One small study found that a typical American college student focuses online on any one task for just 65 seconds. And that's backed up by a much wider body of evidence from people like Professor Larry Rosen, where they just observed, him and his colleagues just observed students as they tried to study. And he found they couldn't focus for more than a few minutes. So the evidence, and I'm pretty sure everyone listening who knows anyone in their life who's under the age of 25 isn't going at the moment, what the hell's he talking about? How can that be the case? This fits with our everyday lived experience. So this is really fucking with us. And I think we've got to understand why, and we've got to look at the solutions. So there was a historical analogy that really helped me to understand how we can begin to solve this problem at a collective level. I'll talk about some of the individual solutions as well. So how old are you, Doug?
I am 34.
Right, so you're younger than me. I'm 43. So you won't remember this, but I remember when I was a kid, my mother used to fill up her car with leaded gasoline. And this is before my time, but not that far before. People used to paint their homes with leaded paint, right? They were the dominant form of paint and the dominant form of gasoline in the world. And it was discovered that exposure to lead in the air completely fucks your brain and is particularly bad for children. It really damages their ability to focus and pay attention. So this science was discovered. It was actually known about for decades, but the lead industry funded a kind of bullshit pseudoscience to deny it, pretend it wasn't happening, say that lead was actually good for you. It was the fault of mothers that they weren't dusting their homes enough, that kind of thing. And so what happened was ordinary mothers banded together across the United States and across the world and just said, we're not going to tolerate this. We're not going to tolerate you doing this to our children. Absolutely not. No. We need to ban leaded paint and we need to ban leaded gasoline. But it's really important to notice what they didn't say. They didn't say, ban all gasoline, ban all paint. I can see you're in an apartment that's been painted. You can see I'm in a hotel room that's been painted. That's all to the good. Outside there, I can see there are cars going by. We targeted the specific aspect that was fucking with our attention, not the whole product. And I think there's something very similar with social media. Because at the moment, the way big tech wants us to think about this is, are you pro-tech or anti-tech? That's not the question. We're not going to go and all convert to join the Amish, nor should we, right? There's loads of great things about technology. We've got to deal with the specific. The question is, what tech designed for what purposes, according to whose goals, right? Because at the moment, the tech we use, there's an analogy with the lead in the lead paint. I spent a lot of time interviewing dissidents in Silicon Valley. The tech we currently use is designed to invade our attention for a simple reason. By the way, don't take my word for it. Sean Parker, one of the biggest initial investors in Facebook, said, we designed it to maximally invade your attention. We knew what we were doing and we did it anyway. God only knows what it's doing to our kids' brains. That's what he said. We now know from the leaked documents from Facebook, they know very well the negative effects they're having. I spent a lot of time interviewing dissidents in Silicon Valley trying to understand this, and they explained to me, look, at the moment, when you open Facebook, TikTok, any of the major social media apps, they start to make money in two ways. The first way is obvious. You see ads. We all know how that works. The second way is much more valuable. Everything you say or do on Facebook is scanned and sorted by Facebook to build up a profile of who you are that they then sell to advertisers so those advertisers can target you. Every time you put Facebook down or TikTok or whatever it is, those two revenue streams go away. So the more you scroll and the more frequently you pick up your phone, the more money these companies make. That's it. That's their business model. So they are constantly asking, how do we get Doug to pick up his phone more often? And how do we get him to scroll for longer? This is the core of this is the only way they make money, right? Just like the head of KFC wants you to eat fried chicken, the head of these social media companies wants you to pick up your phone more and scroll more. So all of their algorithmic power, all of their engineering genius is geared towards one thing: get people to pick up their phones and scroll longer. So it's really, and this is the real revelation for me, you can have social media that doesn't work that way, right? It didn't have to be designed that way in the first place, and it doesn't have to continue working like that any more than we needed to have leaded paint or leaded gasoline. So to understand the alternatives, I interviewed lots of people, but one of the people who helped me to see it was Asa Raskin, who's a designer. His dad, Jeff Raskin, designed the Apple Macintosh for Steve Jobs, and Asa designed a key part of how the internet works, which is called infinite scroll. And Asa explained to me, if you want to fix this problem with attention when it comes to tech, you've got to do one thing. You've got to ban the current business model. Just like we don't allow the lead industry to put lead in our products anymore, just say absolutely in law, a business model premised upon figuring out the weaknesses in people's attention, hacking them, invading them, and selling that attention to the highest bidder is inhuman and immoral, and we will not allow it. And I said to Asa, okay, well, let's imagine we do that, and the other people who advocated this. What would happen the next day after we banned it? Would I open Facebook and it'd say, sorry, everyone, we've gone fishing? He said, of course not. What would happen is they would move to a different business model. And there are two different business models that everyone listening has experience of. One is subscription. We all know how Netflix and HBO work. Another is, think about the sewage system. Everyone listening is connected to the sewers. Before we had sewers, we had shit in the streets. Loads of people got cholera. So what did we do? We all pay for the sewers to be built, and we all own the sewers together. Now, it might be that like we own the sewage pipes together, we want to own the information pipes together because we're getting the equivalent of cholera for our minds. We're getting the equivalent of cholera for our brains, right? For our attention in particular. But whatever alternative model we adopt, the key thing is the incentives completely change. At the moment, you're not the customer of Facebook or TikTok. You're the product they sell to advertisers. But if we move to subscription or some kind of public ownership independent of government, suddenly the model becomes, what do you want? What does the customer want? What does Johann want? He wants to be able to pay attention. Okay, let's design our app not to hack it. Let's design our app not to hack his attention, but to heal his attention. Oh, Johann wants to be able to meet up with his friends offline. Okay, let's design it not to keep people staring at screens, but to connect them so they can meet up offline, look into each other's eyes, feel better. The key thing is, though, until we change the incentives, until we change the business model, it will always hack and invade our attention, right? And these companies won't do it on their own, any more than the lead industry was one day going to go, you know what, guys, I think we've just made enough money. It's fine, we don't need any more. It's not how it works. There has to be a movement of ordinary people defending our minds. At the moment, we're in a race, right? On the one side, you've got all these factors that are invading our attention and will only become more invasive as time goes by. Paul Graham, one of the biggest investors in Silicon Valley, said that the world is on course to be more addictive in the next 40 years than it was in the last 40 years. Think about how much more addictive TikTok is for a child than Facebook, right? We're on that trajectory. On the other side, there has to be a movement of all of us saying, no, we don't want this. We don't want a world where we can't think deeply. We don't want a world where college students are switching every 65 seconds and office workers are switching every 3 minutes. This is not what a good human life looks like. We won't tolerate it. We will fight back against these causes and we will defend ourselves and our children. But it requires a shift in consciousness.
I love how you kind of put things into perspective and you're very blunt with what some of these facts are, and it's scary. And I've noticed myself being more addicted to my phone and social media. And as a matter of fact, that's like one of my other main goals this year is to spend less time on social media and have better boundaries around that. So while you said from a bigger picture thing. Like people have to band together to kind of stand up against some of the big tech companies. Like, what can the average person do to have better boundaries with their screen? Like, is there a certain amount of time every day that's healthy, that won't impact our focus, that you found? Like, what are some simple things we can do?
So I would say install on your phone and your laptop an app called Freedom. So Freedom can cut you off. It will cut you off either from specific websites. So say if you were addicted to Twitter or Pornhub or whatever it might be, it will cut you off from those specific websites for however long you tell it to, or it can cut you off from the entire internet. So one technique that's really helpful is it's called pre-commitment. So pre-commitment, I interviewed Professor Molly Crockett at Yale about this. She's done some really interesting research on it. Pre-commitment is when you want to do something in the future, but you know you might crack. So for me, it's Pringles, right? I go into the supermarket, I buy the Pringles, and I say to myself, you'll only eat a few, right? And of course, I wake up at 2 a.m., the fucking Pringles box is there, I don't eat a few, those fuckers are gone within 5 minutes, right? So my form of pre-commitment with Pringles is I don't buy them in the supermarket because I know that if I put them in my home, I will crack, right? So that's a form of pre-commitment. The K-Safe, which I just mentioned before, is a form of pre-commitment. Freedom is the app Freedom is a form of pre-commitment. It's saying you want to be able to watch a film for the next 2 hours and not look at your phone, but you know that you'll crack, so put Freedom on your phone and then you just won't be able to crack, right? You've locked in your future self. And there's all sorts of forms of pre-commitment that people can try. One form of pre-commitment is actually telling people you want to do it. Just publicly saying to your friends, your family, I want to do this, articulating the goal out loud and saying, if you see me breaking, hold me on it. So there's all sorts of things like that. So I would say absolutely begin the process. And it's hard, but when the pleasures of focus start to kick in, I would also say another element is to think about flow states and how we can pursue them. So flow states are the deepest form of attention that human beings can provide. Everyone listening will have experienced a flow state. A flow state is when you're doing something and you really get into it. And your sense of time falls away, your sense of ego falls away. And the way one rock climber put it is you are the rock you're climbing. And flow is really important because it's both the deepest form of attention we can provide and, crucially, it's the one that feels least effortful. When you're in flow, it's not like, memorizing facts for an exam. It's not like, oh God, it's deeply pleasurable. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, how can we maximize our chances of getting into flow states? Because very often before, when I got distracted, I couldn't focus, I would just blame myself. I'd get angry with myself. I'd say, you haven't got enough willpower. And that absolutely did not help, right? So now I go, well, okay, how can I get into flow? So I went to interview the guy who discovered the concept of flow states, an incredible man named Professor Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. You have no idea how long it took me to learn how to say that. Who researched this for 50 years. I did one of the last interviews with him because sadly he died shortly afterwards. And he discovered a huge amount of things about flow states, but I think there's 3 things in particular that will really help anyone who wants to maximize their chances of getting into this state. There's no guarantee, but you can maximize your chances. The first thing is you have to just do one thing. You have to choose one clear goal and exclude for a good period all your other goals. If you're being interrupted, if you're trying to do more than one thing at once, you will not get into flow. Secondly, you've got to choose a goal that is meaningful for you. If the goal you choose isn't meaningful to you, if it doesn't matter to you, you won't get into flow. So for me, I get into flow through writing. For you, it might be playing the guitar, painting a canvas. If I try and paint a canvas, it looks like if someone vomited on the canvas. I wouldn't get into flow for those things. So it's got to be something that's meaningful to you. If you're trying to do something that's not meaningful, your attention will just slip and slide off of it. And the third thing is it will really help if you choose if you choose something that is at the edge of your abilities, at the edge of your comfort zone. So let's say that you're a rock climber, a medium talent rock climber. You don't want to just try and climb over a garden wall. That's not going to get you into flow. It's too easy. Equally, you don't want to suddenly try and climb Mount Kilimanjaro. That's going to be overwhelming. You want to climb a slightly higher and harder rock face than the one that you climbed last time. So if you do those three things, choose one goal, make sure it's a meaningful goal, and choose one that's at the edge of your comfort zone, but not beyond it, you'll maximize your chances of getting into a flow state. And then that's like a gusher of attention that's inside all of us, where you will find the attention comes easily.
Yeah, I love that. I think I've heard that before, where like when you know you're in flow state, when you're having this healthy balance of comfort and discomfort. You're in the middle and you're just kind of flowing. I want to talk about like focused work. You know, we've talked a lot about our ability to do things that we can to regain focus, and why it's so important to focus on a single task and not multitask. Have you found that there's like a certain amount of time that's like a sweet spot for people to focus on a task? Meaning, like if I'm somebody who wants to get some work done, whether it's something for school, something for my job, whether I'm writing, like is there a time, does it make sense for me to spend like an hour of just being hyper focused, take a rest for a few hours, go do something else and then come back to it? Like, have you found any correlation with that kind of thing?
To be honest, the evidence on this is very mixed. And I think the truth is it just varies from person to person. So I'm someone who, you know, I work in very intense, like 3 or 4 hour bursts where I don't take any breaks. And then if I get in 4 hours, I can't do much more that day in terms of writing. You're obviously doing interviews and things, I can do more. But some people are completely different to that. Some people, it works really well to do half an hour, then take 10 minutes off, then do another half an hour. So it just completely varies. And to be honest, when I looked at it, there's a lot of people who confidently put forward different methods. And the truth is, I think everyone has those methods will work well for some people, but not others. And people just need to experiment and see what's right for them. But I do think there is good evidence that trying to work, and this is something I struggle with because I'm a real workaholic, trying to work all the time is really bad for your attention, right? So if I do those 3 or 4 hours, I sort of know I can't do anything more that day when it comes to writing, but I'll generally tend to try and then the work's just shit. But I know that, and yet I still do it. But it was really interesting. I interviewed this guy called Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's at Stanford, who's a leading expert on organizational behavior. I remember him saying to me, look, ask any sports fan, do you want your team to go onto the pitch just exhausted, having played 10 hours the day before, and 10 hours the day before that, and 10 hours the day before that? Of course not. Everyone wants their team to go onto the pitch well-rested, not stressed. But actually the way we work now, we can talk a bit about how stress fucks our focus, if you like. But also, I'll talk a bit about that. I think it's also very relevant to COVID and what we've all been through in the last few years. I interviewed an amazing woman called Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's now the Surgeon General of California, the senior medical officer in the state. I was talking to her before COVID, but this is relevant to COVID, I think. I remember her saying to me, she explained something about how stress affects attention that really helped me. She said, imagine one day you're walking down the street and out of the blue, you're attacked by a bear and you survive. In the weeks and months that follow, something will happen to your attention that is completely involuntary. Your attention will flip from paying attention to the things directly in front of you, your immediate tasks. They'll become harder because you will be unconsciously scanning the horizon for risk and danger. You're going to be thinking, unconsciously, something came out of the blue. Shit, what else could come out of the blue and attack me? You're looking out for risk and danger. Okay, now imagine that a bear attacked you again. You have to be really unlucky in this scenario, but let's imagine it. At that point, you would likely flip into a state called hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is where you can't pay attention to the stuff in front of you because you are just scanning for risk and danger. And there's a guy, a wonderful doctor in Adelaide in Australia called Dr. John Giardini, who said to me, look, deep focus is a really good strategy when you're safe. Sit down and read a book, you'll learn, you'll grow. Deep focus is a really dumb strategy if you're in danger. You'd be a fool to sit, fighting in the war in Vietnam, reading a novel. You'd be shot in the head, right? Focus evolved to be something we can provide when we're safe. And when you don't feel safe, focus will be really hard. It'll make it harder for you to sleep. We all know that, but it'll just load you with stress. And I think one of the things that happened with COVID, I remember at the start of COVID, when a lot of people were locked in, a lot of people going, oh, this is great. Obviously it was terrible. It was a pandemic, but I'm going to finally read that long book I wanted to read. I'm going to learn French on Duolingo, and no fucker learned French and no one read Tolstoy, right? In fact, people Googling, how do I get my brain to work, rose by more than 300%. because we were really stressed. You know, we were frightened about the virus. We were frightened about how our lives had been upended. We didn't know what was going to come next. This was like a bear attack. And then with the second wave and the third wave, it was like the bear came back, right? So I think it's partly about when you're stressed, not being hard on yourself about how it's screwing your attention, and then looking at the ways that I go through in the book about how we can reduce stress and anxiety. And there's lots of places I went to that found ways for workers to do that. But yeah, so it was a long answer, I know. Sorry, Doug.
No, I'm glad you brought up the stress factor, because I think a lot of times people don't realize how much our stress levels impact so many other areas of our life. And I think sometimes, you know, unless you're somebody who's very self-aware of when you are stressed, we don't even know if we are like hyper vigilant or anxious or whatever. So let's get into some of the solutions of stress and anxiety, because I think people would appreciate knowing like what you found in your research with how people best use some of these strategies to reduce their amount of stress and their ability to prevent themselves from being stressed in the future.
There's all sorts of things, like some of them we've touched on: sleep, diet. There's a big collective one. There's a guy called Andrew Barnes, who I write about in the book, who he worked in the City of London, the financial sector, the equivalent of Wall Street in the 1980s. And in that world, and he quit that world. He didn't, that's not the life he wanted. And he went to Australia and New Zealand and set up a series of very successful businesses. But he always remembered that feeling of having overworked, of having been exhausted, and how bad that was for him. One day he was on a plane in 2018, and he read some really interesting research in a business magazine that just said the average worker only focuses on their tasks when they're at work for 3 hours a day. The rest of the time, they're just anxious, they're messing about. It's like, well, that's not good, right? That's not good for them. Their lives are passing them by. It's not good for the employer. And he suddenly thought, if my company, he owned a company called Perpetual Guardian that administer wills and trusts. If my company cut back from working 5 days a week to working 4 days a week, but I paid people the same amount and people spent that extra day resting, relaxing, decompressing. If in return they worked just 45 minutes more a day, actually focusing, that would be worth it, right? We would be as good as we were. So he called all his staff on a conference call and said, hey, everyone, I'm going to pay you the same, but you're only going to have to work 4 days a week. His head of HR literally fell over. But this change was monitored by the University of Auckland Business School. And the results were kind of extraordinary. The amount of time people spent on social media hugely fell. The amount of focus people had at work significantly improved. The amount of stress that people experienced hugely fell. But what was most mind-blowing was people at the company concluded, including people who had been skeptics at the start, concluded that they achieved more in 4 days than they had in 5. And this is something they found everywhere where a 4-day week has been tried. They tried it in Microsoft in Japan, where they had a 40% improvement in productivity. They tried it in Toyota in Stockholm in Sweden, where the amount of repairs they did on the cars went up by 115%. A whole range of places have tried this. So I would say a big thing that we can fight for, and this should be a collective change. Maybe you'll have a really enlightened boss like Andrew Barnes, but let's be honest, most bosses are not as great as Andrew. This will have to be a collective fight, I think. I think we work way too much. I think it's not good for us as human beings. It's also not good for our work, right? We're just not as good at it because we're exhausted. We're like, imagine if the Dallas Cowboys go onto the pitch and they haven't slept properly and they're exhausted and they've been playing the whole time. They would fuck it up, right? So there's all sorts of changes that I argue in Stolen Focus we need to fight for, and that I think is one of them.
No, and I think that all makes sense as far as like we're always kind of overworked and we're always stressing to get things done, and then that affects our sleep, that affects our mood, and then again it throws our focus off and our ability to work. So we definitely have to work more efficiently. The last question I want to ask you as we close our conversation is specifically focused on addiction. You wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, which I have on my bookshelf, which essentially was your take on addiction and this your idea of a solution on how we can kind of work our way out of that. And I would say that since the book has been written, obviously things have gotten significantly worse. I mean, over 100,000 people, I think, died of a drug overdose here in the States now with the rise of fentanyl and the opioid epidemic. So let's just say that, you're in the driver's seat of getting us out of this. What are some of the things that you think need to change?
Yeah, it's so important what you said. And, as you know, I wrote about this because we had addiction in my family, and this is really close to my heart. So I think we need to change our understanding of what addiction is, and we need to start following the places that have succeeded, not the places that have failed, right? And there are places that had addiction crises even worse than the one in the US at the moment, and that solved those addiction crises. So just a very quick thing about how we get addiction wrong. So if you'd asked me when I started doing the research for the book, God, exactly 10 years, God, I hadn't thought of that, 10 years ago. Let's say you'd said to me, what causes heroin addiction? Because that was something close to me. I would have looked at you like you were an idiot. And I would have said, well, dummy, the clue's in the name. Heroin causes heroin addiction, right? We've been told this story for 100 years that's become totally part of our common sense. We believe, I'm in a hotel in Miami. We think if I kidnap the next 20 people to walk past this hotel, and every day I injected them with heroin, like a villain in a Saw movie, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave. And that's why, they would have this tremendous physical hunger for the drug. It's why we call it in English being hooked, right? You have the hunger for the chemical hooks. It turns out that story is true, but it's a very small part of what's happening with addiction. It's a much bigger picture. And I only really began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and I interviewed an incredible man who you should have on your podcast called Professor Bruce Alexander, one of the great heroes of our time, who did an experiment in the 1970s that has belatedly transformed how we understand addiction. So Professor Alexander explained to me this story we have, that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by the hooks in the drugs, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drug water and almost always kill itself within a couple of weeks. So there you go, that's our story. The rat's exposed to the drug, they want more and more of it until they overdose. But Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing that makes life meaningful for rats. All it's got is the drugs, and it uses them obsessively and overdoses. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat likes in life is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. And of course, they try both. They don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water. They hardly ever use it. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and overdose when they don't have the things that make life worth living, to no compulsive use and overdose when they do have the things that make life worth living. This is why I argue that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, hugely valuable though that is to many people, including lots of people I love. The opposite of addiction is connection. And, we're not rats. That's very important to stress. We're much more complicated. But in terms of the solution, I would say we have to look at the places that took the lessons of Rat Park and applied them to humans. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is staggering. And every year they tried the American way more. They arrested more people, they shamed more people, they imprisoned more people. And every year the problem got worse. Until finally, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they're like, look, we can't go on like this. What are we going to do? So they decided to set up a panel led by a group of scientists and doctors, led by an amazing man I got to know named Dr. João Goulão. And they said to them, you guys go away, figure out what the hell would solve this problem. And we've agreed in advance we'll do whatever you recommend. So it just took it out of politics. So the panel goes away, they look into all of this, they look at Rat Park, and they come back and they say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack, the whole lot. But, and this is the crucial next step, we're going to take all the money we used to spend on fucking people up more, shaming them, imprisoning them, chasing them around, and we're going to take all that money and spend it instead on helping them turn their lives around. Interestingly, it wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States. They do some residential rehab that has value, but most of it was a big program of job creation and housing support for people with addiction problems. Let's say you used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to say to everyone with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. And by the time I went to Portugal, this had been in place for 13 years. It's 20 years now since they did this. Portugal went from having the worst drug problem in the European Union to being the very bottom of the European Union league tables for addiction problems. Overdose fell by 80%. Addiction fell massively. Street crime fell massively. Prostitution fell massively. One of the ways you know it works so well is that virtually nobody in Portugal wants to go back. So all over the world where I went for Chasing the Scream, I saw the same thing. Policies based on love and compassion and practical support to help people. They're not a magic bullet. There's still some problems, but over time, they hugely reduce addiction and they hugely reduce overdose. And policies based on shame and punishment increase all these problems. As we've seen in the United States, let's be honest, the United States has given the drug war a fair shot, right? We've done it for 100 years. We've spent $1 trillion. We've imprisoned millions of our fellow citizens. We have, we've destroyed whole countries like Colombia. And at the end of that, we can't even keep drugs out of our prisons where we pay someone to walk around the wall perimeter the whole time, okay? That is never going to work. There is no country in the world where that has ever worked, right? What works are policies based on love and compassion. We can choose those policies based on love and compassion. I know people who've died of overdoses in the United States who would be alive and having good lives today if we'd done what they did in Portugal. We can choose a better way. On all of these problems that we've been talking about, whether it's our attention problems or addiction, it doesn't have to be like this. There are solutions out there. We just have to fight for those solutions.
And I think that's a good place for us to stop, Johann. And I greatly appreciate your wisdom on that. And you're right, like leading with love and compassion and helping people to rebuild their lives when they are suffering with mental health and with addiction, I think is the way forward and for us to all get better collectively as a society. So I wanted to thank you for your time and coming on. And I definitely encourage people to go check out your book, Stolen Focus, and really learn more about what we've talked about today in our conversation. I think you guys are going to get a lot out of it. And what I encourage you to do, just like I do with almost every other episode, is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Johann said about the importance of sleep with focus. Maybe it was something he said about technology. Maybe it was something he said about food. Maybe it was some of the tricks he shared on us to improve our focus. Whatever it was, tag him, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.